Welcome everybody to my Dante's Inferno lecture number 2. And I'm basically going to go over Canto 5 through 13, which we had assigned, and just try and touch on what I think are the highlights, the most important themes, references, ideas, etc. And again, just go over those with you briefly. So I'm going to pop up on the screen here. This is from a PowerPoint on Dante's Inferno. Remember that famous quotation, abandon all hope, you enter here. I guess that applies to everybody, but Dante's pilgrim, who remember represents every man. He's supposed to represent all people since we're all sinners in need of redemption. And we all find ourselves falling off the righteous path now and again and need to go back onto that righteous path. And this is obviously part of the pilgrim's education. And the reader, in a sense, is supposed to be learning along with the pilgrim and thinking about their souls and their destiny and their sins and their behavior, etc. Right. So this is why this is an allegory, right? The whole Divine Comedy really is meant to be, in a broad sense, educational. So we have, this is another artist portrayal of the different circles of hell, right? This is, remember the landmass part of the earth here, which you can see on the very top, and then funnels down into the center of the earth, which again is supposed to be the farthest point from God, given the assumption at the time that the earth was the center of the universe. We've talked about, actually we talked about what was before circle number 1, which remember was those people who would never commit to anything in their life, and they were just sort of running around completely unguided, impulsive in every different direction, carrying this banner before them. They would never really commit to anything in life, but they weren't really in hell proper. And so when we enter circle number 1, as I mentioned in the last lecture, we have limbo, right? Unbaptized and virtuous pagans who did not accept Christ. And again, if they were born before Christ, they obviously could not have. And limbo, as it says here, limbo is a somewhat pleasant place with fields and a castle, but the people are denied God's presence for eternity. And so there's this sort of endless desire to be closer to God that is refused to them. And these two folks here represent obviously the pilgrim and Virgil. And we do know through what was called the harrowing, right? After Christ died on the cross, that he went down into hell and supposedly pulled out the righteous Old Testament figures, including some people we talked about, Moses and Noah, etc., to bring them up into heaven. But everybody else is stuck in limbo. And remember, this is the place where Virgil dwells, right? Since Virgil was not a Christian. Then circle number 2. This is where we're really sort of entering hell proper, where you're really seeing people be punished and suffering directly. As it says here, the lustful are sentenced to their punishment by Minos, and there's a picture of Minos there who kind of guards them. And as it mentions here, the lustful indulged their passions beyond reason, trapped forever in a violent storm, never to touch anything again. And features the lovers Francesca and Paolo, who I'll mention in a little bit more about in a second. Remember, there is this dichotomy between passion and reason, right? That, again, we've seen all the way back into Plato's day. I think many people today still see passion and reason, or emotion and reason, as, if not in directly contradictory, at least in tension. There has been some movement to start to see them actually as, even though they can be conflicting, as also being aids to one another, guides to one another, depending on how broadly we think about passion or emotion. I mean, if we include intuition and if we include imagination and those kind of things, And so you see some changes in philosophy and psychology in those fields that sort of deal with questions about human nature, of kind of trying to move beyond this idea that passion and reason or emotion and reason are necessarily naturally contradictory. But that was certainly the case here, and grafted onto this, as I know I've also discussed previously, is kind of a gender sort of differentiation, right? Where females are identified with passion and emotion, males identified with reason and logic. Again, a lot of the figures that we will find in this section of hell, where the lustful are being punished, are going to be females, seducers, as they might be called, also daughters of Eve, right? He was able to be seduced by the serpent, and then, in a sense, was able to seduce Adam into eating the apple. So referring to women as daughters of Eve is sort of emphasizing original sin, and the fact that original sin is something that carries across the generations. And obviously women are identified with that. And again, we've seen that in all different forms of misogyny, secular and non-secular, and religious forms of misogyny. So some of the people that are found here, Helen, right? Helen of Troy, who I guess would be considered the person who was responsible for the Trojan War between Greece and the Trojans, because of her attractiveness, her, how much she was desired. We have Achilles, the great warrior. We have Paris, right? So all these people are from can be found in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Dido is also found there, which I think is important, right? We know who Dido is. Aeneas is not found here. So presumably the blame for being the seducer here was Dido, and it was not Aeneas. We might think again, however, and remember that Venus sort of brought on this relationship between Dido and Aeneas by sending Cupid to shoot his arrow, and thus one could claim that it was really Venus's fault, or that Venus was at least partly at fault for what happened here. As well as the problem of completely putting the blame on Dido and on Aeneas for their affair, and for Dido going against her first husband Zacchaeus and saying she would never marry another person, and presumably would never sleep with another person. But obviously Dante's not buying that, right? He's not buying a mythological explanation for human behavior. And again, the relationship to mythology is really complicated in the Divine Comedy, in the Inferno, the first volume 1 that we're reading, because it's utilized sometimes as something that's supposed to send a powerful message to the reader. Other times it's viewed as something that maybe just Virgil is responding to, because that mythology was still very powerful in Virgil's day. So it seems to be kind of used selectively. And so you'll see some different interpretations of how seriously we should take the mythological creatures and the mythological elements of the story. And are these really real people? Helen of Troy, Achilles, etc. Are they just part of the mythology, or at least based part on mythology? And by the way, these are lines 60 through 69 of Canto number 5. Again, all the editions with all different translations will have the same line numbers, so people can find the same place in different editions. Along with that, one of the most famous and important parts of Canto number 5 is Francesca and Paolo, who are found here, and they are sort of tied to each other where they can never be separated, which is part of the punishment for their sin, which is kind of an affair they had that's described as being kind of an incestuous kind of affair. They were reading about Lancelot and Guinevere from part of that tale called Lancelot du Lac, and the reading about that story, and being there together, they ended up having an affair, and sort of want to put the blame on the fact that they was just the circumstances that made them do it, right? That they found themselves together, kind of isolated. They were reading the story; it was very romantic, etc. We of course know that there's a portrayal of Lancelot as sort of and Guinevere, whoever you want to see as the seducer between those two. Guinevere was in the King Arthur stories was King Arthur's wife, and Lancelot had and Guinevere had an affair, etc. As a part of that, and the legend of King Arthur has many different variants, but certainly that's one of the most important parts of that overall story. Notice that Dante's pilgrim really feels pity. In fact, he actually faints at the sight of seeing this kind of the torture that Francesca and Paolo were undergoing here. And it's described by Dante, the author, as the pilgrim falling like a dead body. That's important again, because again, he does have a body. Nobody else who we're encountering here does. They're shades, right? They're just souls because they're disembodied at this point. They're all dead, and their bodies have left them, and they're just souls. But there's several references to the pilgrim having a body, his body, people noticing that he has a body because of the weight of his body, and I'll mention those references. And then as canto number 6 begins, Dante mentions that the pilgrim sort of awoken and he was confused by tears, right? The idea here is that this is a part of his education. He's at the very beginning of it, and that he should not really be feeling pity for Francesco and Paolo because they're sinners. He's supposed to have a kind of, again, I think I described it as a righteous indignation at what they did, and see that it was proper and appropriate that they be suffering, in hell for what they did. But at this point, he still can't put himself in that position to have that kind of righteous indignation. He's still drawn to their suffering and is feeling pity for them. And again, we should follow that. It's really in some ways the major part of the pilgrim's education is his response and reaction to seeing these people in hell, and his response to seeing that the suffering that they are undergoing as he's on his travels here. So when we get to circle number 3, we see the gluttonous here. This is Cerberus, who's described as sort of like a dog, a 3-headed dog. I actually remember writing a book report on Cerberus when I was in middle school. I think it was maybe 7th grade when we were studying mythology all those years ago. Those trapped in circle 3 are constantly maimed by Cerberus, symbolic of their excessive drinking and eating. Again, these are the gluttonous. They're kind of battered by a kind of a muck that they're caught up in, and they have rain and hail and sleet coming down on them. It's described as a very sort of unpleasant experience that they're having there in circle number 3. And here's a sort of a artist portrayal again. They're suffering. They lie in putrid slush, symbolic of the garbage they produced as gluttons. It's continuously raining and hailing on them. They provide quite a hefty snack for Cerberus. Then the pilgrim does see someone named Ciaccio, who is from Florence. And again, he's the first Florentine we see. We know Florence was the home of Dante. And this is the place where we are moving from these references to characters in literature and mythology and characters that would be more broadly known to people who Dante knew from Florence, and typically from, again, this conflict between the Guelphs, who were more like the commoners, and the Ghibellines, who were the nobility in Florence, and then a subgroup within the Guelphs that was called the Black Guelphs and the White Guelphs. Dante was part of the White Guelphs group. And when he meets Ciaccio, he makes a prophecy that about Dante's being sent away from Florence into permanent exile, which we know happened to Dante. And that one of the things involved in that, obviously, that would be a conflict between the White and the Black Elves. That's after they push the Ghibellines out of Florence. And there's also a reference to Pope Boniface. He's described as one who's seen listening to both sides. The idea there is that Pope Boniface, instead of taking a position on the issue and kind of inserting himself into what was happening and presumably, helping the situation, just kind of waited to see who was going to come out on top. And then he would side with them. And it was the Black Elves that came out on top. So he was listening to both sides until he saw that. And then he helped actually the Black Elves to send the White Elves, including Dante, into exile. So this is important, and it's the first time we see, again, somebody from Florence. And as we talk more about these people from Florence, these would be people that, again, he's writing this, remember, in the Tuscan dialect of Italian, and many of the people who would know that dialect from that part of Florence would know about this conflict between these groups, these subgroups of the population in Florence. As this becomes more widely read and translated into Latin, etc., people would not really have known directly who these people were. So historians today are obviously having to research and try and find the names of these people. Some of they can find, some they can't. Some they're, they kind of have some ideas who they might be referenced to, but they're not necessarily sure. But it does seem like kind of opportunistic on Dante's part in writing the Inferno to place his enemies, or the people that were actually his friends but who were sinners, and then I guess who he recognized as sinners, by placing them in hell and seeing them undergo their kind of torturous existence, once they're in hell. One might question whether or not there's anything sinful in that on Dante's part, and that's referring to Dante the author, not Dante the pilgrim or everyman from the story. Then we move to Canto number 7. We move into the 4th circle of hell, and before we first see the hoarders and the wasters, or the greedy and the wasteful. They are divided into 2 groups, each pushing boulders against each other, symbolic of their mundane existence on earth, with sin pushing its opposite sin, kind of against each other. This kind of goes back to a story of mythology about Sisyphus, who was punished by having to roll a rock up a hill every day. Every night would roll back down. He'd have to roll it back up the next day. You might see Sisyphus referred to every once in a while, even in popular culture. If somebody's undertaking a task that is an endless task, where they're never going to be able to achieve what they're ideally trying to achieve, you refer to them as Sisyphean in that task. So again, we have the hoarders or the wasters, or the wasters. The hoarders would also be referred to as the miserly. In our translation, they're referred to that way as miserly. The waster is referred to as the prodigal. And at this point, line 67 in Canto 7, the pilgrim actually asks about fortune, and ends up, who ends up wealthy, who ends up poor, all of that. And Virgil describes fortune as female, of course, like Lady Fortune, and actually uses a description of fortune that's very similar to the way in Boethius, Lady Philosophy describes Lady Fortune, and why Boethius should recognize how fickle Lady Fortune is, and that it was just going to be good luck or bad luck, in terms of whether Lady Fortune was for him or against him. There's only so much good luck and bad luck to go around. He had so much good luck his whole life. Now he's experiencing bad luck in prison, that it's now his time, etc. And then we find in the 5th circle, the wrathful and the slothful. And this is the river Styx, which you might have heard of before as another one of the famous rivers in hell. As it says here, the wrathful are forever attacking one another while stuck in the marsh of the Styx, and as wrathful as violent. It seems appropriate that they would find themselves forever attacking each other. And then on the other side are the slothful, right? And they're kind of seen as opposites, right? The wrathful and the slothful. The wrathful being violent, aggressive, acting out all the time, where the slothful are just kind of lying around doing nothing, right? And those are both viewed as sins. And notice that these parallel the kind of vices which exist in extremes in Aristotle's ethics, right? Where the mean is between the two extremes. And we have here the extremes of prodigality or wastefulness on the one hand, hoarding or miserliness on the other hand, and also wrathful on one hand, slothful on the other hand. And we remember that Dante mentions several times Aristotle. He has Virgil mention Aristotle several times, and that the pilgrim should know who Aristotle is, and is referenced directly. And here we see kind of an example of that. And again, as I mentioned, to understand the kind of philosophy / theology of Dante, it really was kind of a bringing together of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. So that is the river Styx. They need obviously to cross the river Styx. And so here we have Phlegus, who's the guide, who's helping them across the river. Here it mentions the slothful. They are eternally trapped beneath the swampy water of the river. They reach out and try to pull you into that swamp. And this is the river they have to cross to get to the city of Dis, right? And Dis, I believe, was the same name that was used for the underworld in Virgil's Aeneid. It's more like the Christian hell here, and it's sort of the hell central, right, within the gates of the city. And there's a tower outside the gates that they have to make their way through, make their way by. It's mentioned in the story that when, well, first of all, that Phlegus, again, they're all resisting helping the pilgrim on this journey, because he should not be there, because he obviously has a body, he's not dead, and this is only for, again, shades or souls. So there's kind of more resistance there. And Dante references the fact that when the pilgrim gets in the boat goes down a little bit. It doesn't go down when anybody else gets in the boat or go up when people go out of it, because they're just souls. They don't have any weight to them. They're incorporeal, right? Because the pilgrim has a body, everybody notices the boat goes down when he gets in it. You can kind of imagine him after this happens several times, maybe being self-conscious about getting in the boat and maybe trying to get in when nobody's looking, because they're going to see that the boat's going to go down sort of when he gets in it. And there's a very important part of this canto where, and here we have the sins of malice in the shores of Dis, as it's described here. Now your true nightmare begins, for within the walls of Dis are the worst sins of hell. But crossing the Styx, the pilgrim sees another one of his people he knew from Florence. This guy's named Filippo Argenti. This is another very important part of the text, often referenced. He was a political enemy of Dante's, and the pilgrim actually sees Filippo, and this is line 50 in this canto number 8, and he sees him suffering in the Styx, and he really seems to enjoy it a lot. And very different attitude than the attitude of pity that he seemed to have previously. And you wonder, well, because this is a personal enemy now, it's, it seems kind of problematic that Dante is having the pilgrim really enjoy this, because he's seeing somebody who we know personally really, really suffering, and that seems kind of problematic, to say the least. And he actually said he praises the Lord for seeing Argenti be dunked, and he says, "Can I see him be dunked one more time before we get to the other side of the Styx?" And again, that is we might have a problem with that. Virgil kind of responds pretty positively to it. He seems to be at the other extreme from pity, right? So he had pity on the one extreme. He's got this exuberance over seeing Argenti suffer on the other extreme. Righteous indignation is the middle somewhere. He hasn't found that middle ground. That's the way the translator and interpreter of this Penguin edition that we're using is kind of reading what's going on here. I can understand that, but I also still find it somewhat problematic. The fact that it's the first person that Dante personally knew that he didn't like, that he sees suffering in this way, how much he enjoys seeing him suffer. And even though we're supposed to, I think, see Dante the author as putting Dante the pilgrim in a critical light, as a sinner who's lost his way, and enjoying seeing Argente, dumped in the water, et cetera, and suffering. I don't know. It still sees a little opportunistic on Dante's part to do that. Nonetheless, it's an important, really important part of this section of the book. We get to the city of Dis with the arch heretics, as they're called. And there are other creatures that we sort of meet here. The heretics denied immortality and therefore denied God. I'll talk about that in a minute. They're entombed in flaming graves for eternity. Since they believe the soul dies with the body, they will suffer that fate in hell. But before we get to that point, to actually get into the gates of Dis, they run across, you recall, the three Furies again, who are again a distortion of the Trinity, referred to, as many of you already know, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. So they're kind of a distortion of that Trinity. On the side of that Trinity, you'll remember this other Trinity Dante introduced of the Virgin Mary, Saint Lucia, and Beatrice, right? And they were also seen as over and against that other distortion of the Trinity in the three animals that the pilgrim found. The pilgrim came across when he came out of the woods at the very beginning of the story, right before he could climb Mount Purgatory, the leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf, as they're described. So again, we're seeing all of these threes, all these versions of a Trinity, either the righteous Trinity, the divine Trinity, or some distortion of that Trinity. They also see Medusa, and it's interesting the way Virgil wants Dante's pilgrim to cover his eyes when he sees the Medusa. You might remember from mythology that when you see the Medusa, if you look directly at it, you'll turn to stone. Virgil's still kind of caught up in that mythology, right? It was still something that in his day had an impact on people. It still had some kind of influence on them, be it conscious or subconscious, et cetera. And so that mythology is still something that's very much, still with him at the time. The pilgrim doesn't seem to be really worried, right? Dante's pilgrim is of Dante's era. He's not really concerned, but potentially with Medusa, and Medusa really being able to turn him to stone. But Virgil, turns him around really fast, makes him cover his eyes. So this is another place where I think Dante, the author, is kind of playing with the mythology a little bit, using it as something to be taken seriously when he wants to make a point, and showing the difference between Virgil and his era and his views of this mythology, and Dante's pilgrim and Dante's era, and this view of mythology as pagan, right, and something that they have kind of moved beyond, but again, so powerful and such a part of culture that he still felt like he wanted to use that mythology in telling his story. And then very importantly, and the person that put this PowerPoint together, I think, should not have passed over this, but there's an angel that comes to open the city for them, to let them through in the gates, right, of Dis, so they can enter Dis formally. And there's an allegory that occurs here, and Virgil kind of sets this off. Say he kind of signals that this is about to occur, and Dante has the reader sort of pay special attention to the allegory you're about to hear. It's an allegory about the three advents of Christ. The first being Christ's birth and descent into hell. The second being the daily coming into men's hearts of Christ, right? And for the redemption. And then the third is the last judgment. And so the angel is in a sense coming to the aid of the pilgrim to help him finish this tour in his descent of hell so that he can be saved, right? And go to heaven, etc. So again, this is an important part of the story, and the angel will be around for a little bit here in the story. And I think the angel can do what Virgil can't do, because Virgil was not a Christian. Virgil, again, is a shade who still actually dwells in limbo. He's got to go back there after he helps take the pilgrim as far as he can help him. So somebody else, right? Somebody else who really represents the divine needs to assist here, which is why the angel needs to help. And Virgil himself at this point starts to seem a little worried sometimes that he needs help to take the pilgrim on the next step, even though he tells the pilgrim, your journey was supposed to happen. It was underwritten by the Virgin Mary, etc. Right? And this is, you've got the highest authority to be able to do this that you can possibly have. But he's still kind of nervous at some points when they're being threatened, and he still feels that threat a little bit. And I think the pilgrim can sense that, and the pilgrim can sense that Virgil's not 100% confident what's going to happen. And I think that's another reason that we have the angel coming along here, because the angel alone can help them to enter the gates of Dis. Virgil cannot do that. And again, another important part of the story here, I think. So this is what gets us then finally into the heretics as they're described here in circle number 6. And these are some of them are called Epicurean heretics, and this is important. You may have heard of Epicurus before, or people being referred to as Epicurean, right? Epicureans, as it says here, believe that the soul dies with the body and there's no afterlife. So you might as well enjoy your earthly existence and the delights that it can offer you, good food and good wine and fine things, etc., because the soul was going to die with the body anyway. There was no immortality, so enjoy your earthly life as you can. Even today, you'll sometimes hear people who referred to as Epicureans, who again enjoy really good wine and really good food. They enjoy their earthly existence, their embodiedness, and things associated with bodily pleasures like food and wine and other kinds of bodily pleasures. So I just wanted to mention that specifically the Epicureans are kind of highlighted here. Here they also come across somebody named Farinata. This is another one of these Florentine characters. He's a Ghibelline leader. So he's not one of these subgroups of the Guelphs that the pilgrim belongs to, but he's of the Ghibellines. He's here because he's very haughty. And he comes across as very haughty. And supposedly he died just prior to Dante's birth, but Dante knows of him, his reputation, his infamy, you might say. And he prophesies Dante's being banned from Florence. So Dante's, kind of keeps hearing this story. And this is true that this would happen even though the Guelphs would defeat the Ghibellines, when they would break into the Black Guelphs again, would force the White Guelphs out of Florence, including Dante, who would end up have to live in exile. And Dante, the pilgrim, asks specifically of Farinata, because he realizes after talking to some of these people that they don't know what's going on in the present. And some of them will actually ask him what's happening in his own day and time, in his own era in Florence, because they don't know. They know the past, they know the future. So, like I said, the pilgrims kind of tempted to ask them about what's going to happen in the future, and some of them are actually telling him, what's going to happen. These being things that Dante is already aware of, that the pilgrim is not aware of. But by the same token, they keep asking him what's going on in the present time, including this character Cavalcante, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this is the explanation. We get this explanation from Farinata. Again, the pilgrim wants to know the shade's capacity for knowledge of the present. Farinata states that while they have complete knowledge of things past and future, they are ignorant of the present, except, of course, for the news of current events brought to them by the new arrivers to hell, like the pilgrim, though the new arrivers are typically the shades, they're ending up in hell. Even this knowledge will be denied them after the day of judgment, when all will become absolute and eternal, when they're totally kind of fixed in place. The door of the future will be closed, and the remembrance of the past will fade away, since there will no longer be any past, present, or future. Right? There'll be just an is. Remember, that was described by Boethius as God's being in the cosmos is just no past, present, or future, just is. Right? There's no narrative time. There's no body to move through narrative time. So, like the other sinners in hell, Farinata is caught in the present moment because he cannot do anything in the present to change the future. Right? He's kind of stuck in the state that he's in. So this is the explanation that he gives to the pilgrim. So Cavalcante, somebody else that Dante sees here, he really does, he wants to talk with him. Cavalcante wants to talk with the pilgrim, specifically about his son Guido, who Dante himself actually referred to as his first friend. Guido, it's been claimed, was actually the husband of Beatrice, which you can see why that he would be a close friend of Dante's. He was also a poet. And Cavalcante sees the pilgrim there, and he sees the pilgrim and thinks that if the pilgrim's dead, that Guido must be dead too. And he really starts worrying, where's my son? What happened to him? And are you here with him? And the pilgrim says, no, I'm here with this other person. And he points over to Virgil, and Cavalcante knows that that's not his son. And he thinks, oh my God, what's happened to him? Where is he? But the pilgrim is interrupted by Farinata. So the pilgrim doesn't get a chance to tell Cavalcante, as far as I know, Guido's okay. Everything's fine. Don't worry. But as they leave, the pilgrim says to make sure to tell Cavalcante that as far as he knows, Guido's okay, that he shouldn't worry, that he was interrupted by Farinata, and then he was caught up in this question of asking Farinata about why they don't have knowledge of the present. This then brings us to circle number 7, the violent and the bestial, as they're described here. There are 3 main kinds of violence. As you can see here, there's violence against your neighbor, violence against the self, and then violence against God. Presumably, violence against God is the worst of these. Violence against God has also, however, been described as violence against nature, because nature is God's creation. And you might notice that nature is capitalized here, right? To let you know that they're not just referring to nature generically, right? Nature as God's creation, nature as in a sense, a part of God. This is also, I think, tied in with the reason why suicide, kind of violence against the self, was seen as a sin. Your life was given to you by God as a gift, and your body along with it. Doing violence to your body, to somebody else's body, taking your own life is seen as actually a kind of violence against God and a violence against nature. So all these things are interrelated. And I think the way that they're described here, we're supposed to see them as all interrelated, and it's why they're all part of the same circle of hell, circle number 7. Interestingly, in circle number 7 too, you might have seen that when the pilgrim is asking questions, Virgil references, he says, but you should know, you should have read about and be aware of your ethics and your physics. And we might think, okay, whose ethics, whose physics is he talking about? He's talking about Aristotle's. because he knows that the pilgrim has read Aristotle, and Aristotle's Ethics is actually the Nicomachean Ethics that we read part of that's being described here. Another one of the great texts of Aristotle is Physics. Both of these were texts that were translated by Boethius. And so when he's referring to he's referring to the ethics and the physics of Aristotle. So again, we see Aristotle being referenced again. He also talks about Aristotle's belief, his idea that art imitates nature, and the linkage between those two. Excuse me. That was also something you see in Plato. Plato and the Greeks were known of adopting a theory of art called mimesis, mimesis. And mimesis, you can see the same root as the word mime. So that art in the terms of music, in terms of painting, drawing, sculpture, was supposed to, in a way, mimic nature. Not to be an exact copy of nature, but to sort of mimic it in action in some way, in some specific kind of context. However, that word mime does show that it's supposed to be kind of a replica of nature in a sense. So not an exact copy, but a kind of replica. And that was how you would judge the quality of a work of art. What kind of replica was it of these things that actually exist? One of the reasons that Plato was very skeptical about art, that again is something I know I've referenced. Remember that art's something that plays on the passions and not on reason, therefore it can corrupt you, especially young people who haven't developed their rational capacities yet and can be kind of pulled along by their emotions. Also, Plato viewed art as what he called a copy of a copy. And it was twice moved from reality. There was the real thing that existed for Plato, which was that ideal that existed in what he called the realm of the forms, right? Where essences existed. These blueprints are copies of everything in a form of perfection that could only exist in the realm of ideas. Things in this earthly world were a copy of those. And then art was a copy of those things in this earthly world. And, each time you make a copy of something, it becomes a little less like the real thing, right? There's that replicability issue. They even talk about that in cloning and genetics, that you have little imperfections that enter in each time you make a copy of something. So Plato's, talks about art and its inferiority in those terms, and it's why people should try and put themselves in touch with, contemplate intellectually the forms themselves, these in the realm of ideas, right, which exists outside the cave in the sunlight, rather than being caught up in the cave and putting all your attention on earthly kinds of things, and including on art. Your true guide to your life should be these forms, should be your attempt to try and understand the good, justice, all these virtues and important ideas that only exist in perfection in the realm of the forms. The seventh circle is described as having kind of a steep slope. And you can see it's kind of portrayed in terms of a minotaur and then a number of centaurs. The way the slope is described is it's kind of a landslide that they had to make their way down that occurred during the earthquake that shook the earth as Christ descended into hell. So it was this kind of landslide that was created, and they're having to make their way down this sort of landslide. Again, Virgil knows that much, but he only knows of Christ as the mighty one or the mighty Lord. He doesn't know of him as Christ. Presumably the pilgrim would know who that was a reference to. But you see here that the Minotaur and the centaurs, who are kind of the guards in this circle, and it's a kind of a river of boiling blood. And we've got here, says it, murderers and war makers are immersed in boiling blood, symbolic of the blood of those they killed. And centaurs pictured here guard the banks and shoot arrows at anyone who tries to escape. So this is violence against neighbors, which would be, I would assume, include violence between these political groups and in Florence and in Italy, right? The Guelphs and the Ghibellines and the Black and the White Guelphs, etc. Then we have the middle ring, which again, violence against the self. We'll talk about the woods of the suicides in a second. Their souls are encased in thorny trees. The harpies feed upon their leaves. And then we have ultimately in the very center, violence against God. And the blasphemers, the sodomites, and usurers, all committed to a profane act against God. They are laying over burning sand or forced to ceaselessly run around in circles. The sky rains fire symbolic of God's wrath on them. There's another reference in Canto 12, where Circle 7 is discussed, to the pilgrim's body, when it's noticed that he moves everything he touches, which a shade wouldn't, which a soul wouldn't. There's a reference to Alexander being found in this realm. We know Alexander, was a conqueror. However, there are questions about whether or not this really was a reference to Alexander the Great or not. There were some other Alexanders in history. One other who was engaged in warfare, and the translator of our edition suggests it may have been this other Alexander, not Alexander the Great. Remember that Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle's, and that association with Aristotle, I think, is another reason to kind of raise this question about whether Alexander the Great is being referenced here or a different Alexander. It's also mentioned that Dante is growing quieter and more observant over time. He sees the seriousness of what he's experiencing. It's starting to sink in, especially as he sees these people who have committed more grievous sins and the suffering that they're undergoing for those sins. He also kind of recognizes at this point that Virgil can read his mind, and he doesn't need to say things. He doesn't need to ask things. With Virgil able to kind of read his mind and sense what he's focused on and what's disturbing him, again, what he has questions about, etc. So he seems to be quieter, more introspective, and more observant at this point. Again, they have to cross this river, the Phlegethon that you can see in the top here, in this slide that shows violence against neighbors. The forest that includes the people who committed violence against self, the Wood of the Suicides, as it's known, very famous. You'll see it in other kinds of literature. It's a dense forest where the pilgrim hears all kinds of wailing and moaning. And interestingly, in lines 28 through 51, after Virgil suggests he do so, he breaks off a little piece of one of the branches and it bleeds. And you might remember that actually happened in the Aeneid, one of the first places the Trojan people stopped and were thinking of making a new home for themselves. Aeneas ended up breaking off the end of a twig, and it started bleeding, and he was digging in the ground, and there was blood coming out, etc. And he actually ended up hearing the voice of Polydorus. And it turned out that it was Polydorus' burial site, and he's saying, "Why are you digging in the ground? Why are you harming me? Why are you hurting me? This is not the place that's supposed to be your new home. You have a lot more traveling to do, etc." And when Virgil talks about breaking off this piece of this twig in lines 28 to 51, he actually will make specifically a reference to that. Having read my book, you probably can understand what's going on here. And what the symbolism is supposed to be here, in terms of this, Wood of the Suicides, that they lost their bodies And that's why they're not in any kind of, I mean, even though these other bodies are still representing souls, these particular souls, shades, um, don't even have anything that represents a human body. They were just kind of swirled about in the wind, and then they landed in the ground almost like seeds, and then they grew into these like tree-like beings. So they no longer even had human form of any kind. Um, it's interesting too, at the very end of this, in line 82, it's mentioned that the pilgrim kind of feels pity for these souls. But notice that, and this is something that our translator references, that if you look carefully, that pity is not for their punishment. He seems to believe that, yes, they should be punished for committing suicide. The pity is more for what they experienced that made them commit suicide in the first place. So that this is supposedly not contradicting the fact that the pilgrim is supposedly on this journey and has made progress towards having the right attitude towards seeing people suffering and people, undergoing sin, that again, you can call righteous indignation, because this pity is not pity about the suffering these people are undergoing. It's pity about the suffering that led them to commit suicide and now suffer in hell as part of the wood of the suicides here. And they have, again, the harpies feeding upon their leaves. These are more of these distortions of the Trinity, taking form of animals that are supposed to be portrayed again as feminine, right? Again, this misogyny really does run throughout Western culture, unfortunately. And I already talked about the rest of circle number 7. So that takes us actually up through cantos number 13. I have one final lecture that I'm going to be doing. We're not going to read quite all the way through the Inferno, but we will read a few more canto. So again, I'll do a lecture on those, and I will talk a little bit of what happens at the very end of volume 1 of Inferno, and then a little bit about what happens in the after that point, that we're not going to be reading any of. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email me. If you want to talk about anything from the readings or anything else, you can always let me know. If you'd like to set up a Zoom meeting with me as well, I'm perfectly happy to do so. So enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you again before too long.